Please welcome first-time director and screenwriter, Rebecca Hall. I had to emphasize the fact that it's first time writing and directing because you're so incredible directorially. I want to bring up from the get-go the choice of black and white. And from my perspective, we have visual expectations. This whole film is about skin tone and race and identity. And you do something very subversive where I was noticing, I caught myself noticing skin tones, and then I felt terrible because I was reducing the characters to their skin tone. And I was just wondering if that was your intention and to talk about the choice of black and white.
Well, good. I mean, yes. By the way, hello everyone, and thank you very much for coming. It doesn't cease to surprise me to see people in theaters, so I really appreciate it. The answer to that question is, of course. I mean, it's all, so many of these things are about perception and context, and I think to take the world out of the real world as we perceive it, but make it an abstraction, draws attention to each of our individual perceptions and sense of context. I mean, to an extent, we all see what we want to see. I think a lot of us see ourselves in people and identify things about, and I think that I love in a way that many people, I absolutely saw this, and then someone else can say, but I absolutely saw this. And part of me is thinking, well, you absolutely didn't see anything as we see it because the film is monochrome. It doesn't look like the world. But, I think that the choice is about messing with your perception. It is. At first glance, it looks like I'm being very literal. Like this is a black and white film, therefore the film is in black and white. It's actually about your perception of that literalness because nothing is black and white, and nobody can be reduced to one definition. Even black and white film, it's 1,000 shades of gray, just like the subject matter. So that's my private joke, really.
And then when I introduced the film, I told them to keep an eye out on the ratio, the choice, and it's so complex because there is a compression which helps with the characters. But then, tell us. I'd love to hear you talk about the choice.
It's funny. Both the black and white and the aspect ratio were choices that I sort of came to me as I was reading the book, which was 13 years ago. I read the book and pretty much immediately started drafting a screenplay, and the first draft of it I finished in 10 days. Wasn't that great, whoever said wow, but thank you. It was, it was a first draft, and I was 25. And but I suppose the big ideas came, and it wasn't really until after I sat with them for a while that I really understood why I wanted to make them. In a way, they were very instinctive. I had a very instinctive response to the book. I just started seeing the film in my head. And I didn't even know about aspect ratio when I started thinking in this way. I knew about old movies. I loved old movies. And I kept thinking, what is it about those sort of movies that has this sort of different filmic quality? And then over time, I found out it was the aspect ratio, that an Academy standard is this slightly squarer thing that then became more of a television standard when film became widescreen. But it's also really about containment. I mean, the story for me is so much. Nella Larsen had this uncanny ability to sniff out all of our desires to stuff ourselves and other people into containers. And in a way, by showing that, she points out how messy humanity is. And the more we try and stuff it into a container or a category, the more likely we are to spill out the sides of it. So, the aspect ratio becomes That is sort of a literal choice. I literally put them in a box, put them in a container.
And I also love that it's all about faces, with that old Hollywood aspect.
Yeah, I mean, that's, for me, that's aesthetically has always been for me, TV has become such an incredible, innovative format, but you see so much anamorphic, widescreen, beautiful stuff on television that in a way that sort of quality of cinema, it doesn't really exist in the same way. And for me, on a personal level, 4:3 just feels very uniquely and idiosyncratically cinematic in a way that I don't know that we have anymore in such a specific way. And I feel it's very unique, and it does frame the face. There's literally no room for anything on the side of the frame. So in a movie that's about how we look at faces, how we perceive them, how they want to be seen, it's very confrontational. It's constantly scrutinizing. There's nowhere to hide. And I think, the choice to shoot, there is a lot of close-ups in this as well, because it looks so great in 4:3 and it has that confronting quality. And so you can go in very tight, and that was very deliberate, because without it being oppressive, it feels part of the world. I think that's the framing.
Indulge me, your cinematographer and you came up with a lens that the top of the frame and the bottom of the frame is fuzzy and blurry. Can you indulge me and answer that question?
Well, this was Edu's brilliant idea. Like, he came onto the project sort of oddly late, actually, in many ways. I've worked with him twice as an actor.
The Gift.
Yeah, and The Awakening was the other one. And so I knew his work very well, and I'd watched him on the sidelines as an actor, and I thought he's sort of has such an eye for beauty, to put it really sort of like basely, but he understands that. And I initially had actually got another cinematographer, and then there was a huge scheduling conflict, but I panic called Edu and said, "Can you get on a plane in 24 hours?" And he said yes, arrived, and then I'd done all these storyboards and I'd made all these shot lists that I hand drew, and I showed him, I gave him all this sort of material very quickly that he had to download and process immediately, which he did. And within 24 hours, he knew exactly what I was trying to do. And it was a very symbiotic relationship, very fast as a result, and I'm very grateful for it on many levels. But one of the things that came out of the conversations that we had was that I said, and I said this to every head of department, whether it was the costumes, the production design, the actors, or anything, I said, everything about this film has to be passing. And what do I mean by that? I just mean that everything has to have its own sense of performance. So even the film has to have its performing cinema. It's in dialogue with older films. It's in dialogue with its place in cinematic history. And in that sense, it's passing. Like little details like costumes, for example. There are some costumes in here which are not from the 1920s. Claire often wears things from the 1940s and 50s. She's passing for someone. Her costumes are passing. The production design similarly has a lot of different elements that have nothing to do with historical accuracy, but have an emotional connection. And the cinematography was obviously a huge part of this. And, Edu and I spoke about this. How can we achieve this without it looking like nostalgia, without it looking like a museum piece or homage to noir or something like this, which I wasn't interested in doing. But it had to have this sort of painterly quality to feel that sense of, like a heightened sort of aesthetic performance, if you will. And he came to me and he said, "I've got an idea," which is you take this lens called a Lomo, which people use all the time in like music videos. It's oppressively sort of wide and very kind of stylistic. It's, because it has this softness on the top and the bottom of the frame. But no one had taken a Lomo and then compressed it into 4:3, which means that the focal point takes away a certain amount of that blur, so it's not distracting, but it creates this sort of wash over the whole image, which has this painterly quality. And he did a test on it and showed it to me, and it had this, it was so unique. It felt so, oh yes, this is it. This is exactly what I'm saying. So that was a really great moment when he brought that.
Yeah, it's so striking. Speaking of painterly moments, composition-wise, you and Ed, Claire is at times positioned that she's almost overtaking Irene visually. You know, can you talk about that choice and composition?
Yes, I mean, you've sort of said it. I suppose there were many ways that I thought about choreography as being important, which is sort of funny because I think a lot of, you know, often if it's an actor turned director, there's an assumption that you're not going to make something that has formality to it, you know, that you're going to let your actors be completely free to do whatever they want. Now, me as an actor, I don't actually respond well to total freedom. I kind of like a certain amount of constraint within which I can have complete emotional freedom. I like to know that a director has a vision, and I think sometimes the blocking can really do that. You know, it's difficult to explain, but it was almost overwhelming to walk into a space like this and be like, you know, cry anywhere you want. You know, you're like, okay. But if you're like, I only have this tiny space within which to have an emotional breakdown, I'm suddenly like, oh, I can do that. And I suppose one of the things I said to both Tessa and Ruth and Andre pretty early on was, this is not, we're not going to get to set and wing it. We don't have the time for a start. I mean, we're a tier 1, very low budget production we shot in 23 days. So there was that. But also, to achieve that formality and that stylization, we can't just sort of, you know, dance our way into this and then work out where the camera is going to be after the fact. So I'm going to be very prescriptive about what the moves are, where you are, like when you're in a mirror, when you're not in a mirror, when a scene plays out in a 2-shot, we're going to work really hard, so that's my only option. You know, we're not going to shoot anything else, and we're going to choreograph it precisely. And because of that, I was able to construct these moments that are very specific. Like, you know, you see Irene standing in a shot, and then she leaves, and Claire literally takes her body position, which has a kind of eloquence, one hopes. And that was all very conscious.
Which is, you know, is the beauty of what you've done and what I teach. And I preach to my students that in the best movies, the content dictates the choices. And your film is like a textbook, you know, example of that, is that you can enjoy the film and you understand what the film is trying to convey to you, but if you pause your film, a certain frame, a certain shot, you're able to basically get what you're trying to convey visually. For example, the mirrors. It's repeated throughout the movie. Irene is staring at herself in the mirror. The scene with her husband, he is a projection on the mirror as she's getting ready, etc. It's the fact that all this was so carefully thought out. I was just blown away watching first-time director. Go ahead, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. It's completely fine. Thank you. I mean, I'm a painter as well. I don't exhibit. I don't do it professionally, but I've always drawn and painted, and I even as an actor, I think I've always been interested in the sort of in contradiction, like a sort of, because I've always believed that a character always has a mask that they're projecting to the world, and they have an interiority. And for me, it's always the challenge of an actor to find a way to show both at the same time, which is, you know, something teachers and acting coaches are like, you could never play two things that contradict each other. And I think that you can, providing that you have the visual signifiers to show see the contradiction point. So I was always thinking about that. If Irene is saying one thing, what is in the frame that is undercutting that? What is in the frame that is subtly starting to make you as the audience question her reliability? And it can be small, like she's talking about, how in control she is and all the rest of it, but she's running around her house and dropping things and getting increasingly, she goes down to the kitchen and sniffs the food, but you can tell that she has no input on what the cooking is. And it's these sort of slowly add up to her unrest within her own house. But it's all about that juxtaposition and antithesis, like finding the visual language that undercuts what's being spoken. Because how else, in this movie, no one says what they feel, really, with maybe the exception of Claire, ironically.
There is a soundscape to the film. It's very visual, but I was so aware of the sound, including silences as well. Can you talk about that aspect?
Yes, happily. It's actually my favorite element, funnily enough. I realized, it was my first time doing this, so it was sort of news to me that during the post-production process, the thing that fixated me the most and fascinated me the most was the sound design. I think I ended up getting 3 separate sound mixes, which on a movie that had no money was really a big ask. And thanks to Dolby, in the end, we got the final mix. But every mix, I just kept wanting more mixes because it was surprising how difficult it was to achieve sorts of meaningful quiet. There's a sort of default mode of sound design to fill up every space with quote unquote realistic noise, birds tweeting and cars honking and all the rest of it. And I'm not really exaggerating. It makes me sound like a lunatic, but I'm not exaggerating when I say there isn't a bird tweet or a car horn in this movie that wasn't carefully thought about and placed. And it was so the texture and the fabric. I was so interested in not showing, you think about the jazz age, and there is an instant thing that it's the jazz age, it's busy, it's noisy. And yes, all those things are true, but this story is about the interiority of one person who is very limited with her experience of the jazz age. So how she experiences New York, how she experiences her house, how she experiences, that all comes in with sound. And you can make an oppressive environment with those elements, the creaking of the floorboards, there's so much texture in all of that, and also finding space for people to think, because this is so ambiguous. There are so many interpretations of this movie, and rightly so. I'm sure everyone sitting here has got probably very strong opinions about what they think it's about. Some of you will think it's entirely about adultery. Some of you will think it's entirely about repressed homosexuality. Some of you will think it's entirely about, racism and internalized self-hatred under the patriarchy and God knows what other systems of oppression. They're all right. But for you to find those, you need space to think and to actually work for the film. And a sort of key thing for me, kind of at the beginning of the process actually, was like for the first 5 minutes, for example, were another idea that came in the first draft. Because I kept thinking of that funny thing that people say about musicals. I know it's not really relevant, but people have this there's an old adage about making movie musicals, that you've got to do a song in the first 3 minutes so everyone knows where you are, what kind of movie this is, and they accept that reality. And I kept thinking about that, and I was like, how do you train an audience within the first 5 minutes that this is a movie when everything is not as it seems, and if you're going to get anything out of it, you've got to really lean in and pay close attention. And the only way I could think of doing that was to create a soundscape that was pretty silent and doesn't really let you in on what the world is or where you are, and is confusing and disorienting. So you have to literally lean in and try and hear what's happening, and you're sort of left with that, hopefully, for the rest of the film. Just going, am I taking this, bad pun, at face value, or am I getting more out of this? Am I thinking more out of this? And, you know, because that's the hope, because I do think it rewards you the more you think about it. And that's not me, that's the book, actually. That's one of those things. It's like a 93-page book. And the more it feels so simple on first reading. You're like, well, nothing really happens until something massive happens. But if you really engage with it, it keeps giving. It keeps on giving. And that was a guiding light for me with the adaptation and the filmmaking. I was like, that's the thing that I want to try and capture.
You do introduce us to a musical motif, the Homeless Wanderer. When did that come into being?
It was about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was redrafting this script, trying to send it out to financiers and stuff. And I came across this piece of music, and I had it playing. And something that I was preoccupied with a lot as a director is that it's really hard to describe tone. Like, it's almost impossible. And when something is as tonally specific as this, it's like, how do you communicate that to everyone so that they can do this thing? How do you talk about tone? And I was sitting there and I heard this piece of music and I thought, oh, wait a minute, that's it. That's the tone of the film. This sounds like how I want the movie to look. Doesn't make sense, but it sort of makes sense. You know what I'm saying? And then I looked at what the music was, and I found out that it was called Homeless Wanderer, and I nearly fell off my chair. I was like, well, that's slightly destined. I don't know how. And it suddenly became, and I didn't want score. You know, I really didn't. I love music. It has a profound effect on me. My mother's an opera singer. I play music. I'm a piano player and other things, but...
A painter.
Yeah, but none of these things are that serious. I feel like they're all part of being a film director, honestly. But it can be so potent, music, and it can tell you so aggressively what to feel, which can be useful, but it can also not be useful, especially when you're trying very hard not to tell anyone what to feel ever with a movie. But I started thinking about Homeless Wanderer. I was like, well, if I'm going to think in any way conventionally in movie scoring terms, then this piece of music is the score. And it's more than that. It's Claire's theme, but it's stuck in Irene's head. You know, so you only hear it on Irene, and it has this looping, non-resolved, sort of incessant quality that is sort of almost irritating whilst being exquisitely beautiful. Mm-hmm. And that's Claire in Irene's head. But then I started thinking, well, if that's the only piece of score, how do you tell other stories? How do you incorporate other pieces of music? And I wanted everything to be, you know, in the world of the movie. But I did kind of want Irene to have a theme somewhere. And that's when I came up with this idea, which is a whole subplot, which only I will ever know about, and you now I'm about to tell you, but it pleases me, of the trumpet player over the road, who's learning you start hearing him at the beginning of the movie when Irene walks home. It's the first time you really hear music, is that section. And you hear him, and he becomes increasingly part of the fabric of this world. And the idea is that he is not really sure what his voice is as a musician, just in a way, if you will, like Irene doesn't really know who she is. But as the film progresses, you hear him start to find his soul, his story, but it sounds like the Homeless Wanderer by the end. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very, I remember lots of producers and, you know, the people who I love on the movie who are incredible would look at me sideways and be like, that's really how you want to score the film? I was like, yep. And that was Dev, and so I got Devonte Hines in to do that trumpet story, which he does exquisitely. And then he also added these other things, like he took Homeless Wanderer and he sort of remixed it and deconstructed it for that dream sort of migraine-y, blurry sequence. And, you know, and other than that, there's the music within the context of the world, and there's the Alberta Hunter at the end, which is the only time you ever hear a voice, very deliberately.
Going back to what you mentioned about us interpreting, you do set up in the writing and in the directing this contrast, opposing forces, you know, gay and straight and black and white, etc.
Male, female,
the
rich,
man and
poor.
female.
Yeah, there's
you
a lot
know,
of them.
can you talk about those deliberate contrasts?
Well, this is a world of binaries. It's about categories and it's about the limits of them. So the more of them that we have, the more I think those themes become realized. And there are all of these elements. You know, you have Hugh Wentworth, this literary character who goes up to Harlem and goes up with his wife, but as everyone knows is probably cruising for guys, and he's in the closet, and Irene knows, and there's that undercurrent, and how that informs their discussion and their power dynamics as well, in terms of who's got a secret on who. There's, you know, you have Irene's maid in her house, Zulina, who on some level is very analogous with both of those women. Like, she's the same age, she's objectively beautiful, but there's a hierarchy and there's a pecking order in terms of their status and their wealth that, you know, corresponds with their complexion. And these binaries are very rigid and frightening, I think. And they contribute to how all these secrets that everyone's holding and all these sort of systems of constraint. And the ultimate one, of course, is Irene. Because Claire, ironically, you know, she's the one. I mean, I'm sure you don't. I hope you don't need me to explain the movie, but you know, this is sort of the kind of turn of the story. Is it purports to be about this one woman who's hiding her racial identity, but it ends up actually being about the other one who's not hiding her racial identity, but is arguably hiding everything else about herself to herself. Her sense of social performance is so rigid and so constrained, and she's so bound by needing to do the right thing, be the right kind of woman, the right kind of wife, the right kind of mother, the right kind of member of the black community, the right kind of on and on and on, and it goes, that you slowly begin to realize that she's so constrained by that, she has no idea who she is. Because that's really what we get to with the book, and hopefully the film, is it's not really about, yes, it is about racial identity, but it is actually about how any one of us struggle with this thing of, this is the sort of person that I ought to be, this is the sort of person that I believe I want to be, versus the person that I really want to be. And how much freedom do any of us have to work out what the hell that is, even?
You answered a question that I was going to ask you about how all of us negotiate freedom and identity, and that's what's so remarkable about your film, is that it's very, very specific about passing and race, but then all of a sudden it makes us wondering, you know, how are we passing? How are, you know, the choices we've made, et cetera. I did want to ask you about Ruth Negga and Tessa Thompson's roles. They were so beautifully written, but I don't recall ever sitting through a film where I felt they could be interchangeable. The one actress could play the other part. It was that, I mean, based on all the mirrors and all the things that you've done, that was intentional, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they're two sides of a coin. I mean, they're completely sort of diametrically opposed, but at the same time, you can see elements of the other in them all the time, and that was very deliberate. And when I was casting it, I always thought there can only really be one Claire to one Irene. It's like the perfect kind of finding that perfect balance. And in a sense, if it were a stage play, you know, it would be one of those gimmicky productions where it's like switch roles every night. like, but it could be that. But and funnily enough, when I was casting it, I went to Ruth. I'd, admired from afar for forever, and I'd been thinking about her in this for a long, long time. I finally cornered her at an industry party in 2016 or 2015, something like that. And I said, "Can I send you this script?" And I didn't say what part. And she read it and then asked to take a meeting, and we sat down, and I assumed that we were sitting down to talk about Irene because it is technically the larger part, but whatever. But I just assumed that on some level. And I sat down, and she said to me, I love this script. I think it's brilliant. I love the book. I want to be a part of it. I'll do whatever you want me to do, but you have to let me play Claire. I mean, it was so clear. And that was so exciting for me because, of course, I'm an actor, so I know that thing when actors are like, I've got to do this. That's exciting because you don't know really I didn't know what she was going to bring. I knew it was going to be brilliant. So then it was really about finding the perfect Irene for her, for her Claire. And then Tessa was, when I started actually spending time with as much of Tessa's work as I could lay my hands on, I couldn't stop thinking about her as Irene, even though I knew she'd done nothing quite like it. It should go without saying, but it is a fiendishly difficult part to play. And I think because there is no let up. Like, how on earth do you show the interiority of someone who's having a nervous breakdown who doesn't even know or admit that she's having a nervous breakdown? It's sort of an impossible ask of an actor. And I remember looking at Tessa's work, and she has this quality of vulnerability, which is a quality that you always want in an actor, this kind of openness. But it's almost sensual how she expresses it. It's like she goes through the world in this very feeling sort of way. And I thought, if you take that and then you bury it with several layers of social mores and politeness and all of that stuff from the period, and you bury that, you put that underground, then you've got Irene. And I'm not sure that anyone, people can do the politeness and the repression thing, but to have that sensuality lurking under the surface, that sniff of the possibility of this whole other person, that's unique to Tessa in my mind. And I think she nails it in a way that I think they both do. They're both extraordinary. Like, it was just an absolute honor to watch them work. Alexander Skarsgård, Claire's husband, is such a tricky role. He could have easily become a villain, and you and him modulate the role into, somebody complex. Can you talk? Was that tricky? Yeah, I had the same conversation I had with him that I had with every actor. It's like, okay, so what are you passing as? But we got into a bit of a tangle with him because it's like, okay, what are you passing as? You're a racist. You have to be a racist. There's no way around that. But yet, you're married to a black woman and you love her. Like, you really love her. You don't know that, but maybe on some deep level, who knows? There's it's tied up in some sort of complicated narrative in your head. But that's what we really spoke about, was like, you love your wife and you're heartbroken at the end.
And last but not least, when I introduced the film, I told them about your background and your grandfather. Can you tell them your association to the book and to your family?
There's no brief way to do this, but I'll try. Reading this book was more for me than reading a great work of literature. It is a great work of literature, but it also gave me personally language, context, empathy, compassion, understanding, of a choice that was made in my family that meant a huge amount of my history and heritage was erased. From my mother, from me. My grandfather, he was born into, both of his parents were black, both of his parents were black. They did extraordinary things. I now know. I found, I spent 13 years trying to uncover all this. And part of the journey of making this film was also a journey of trying to get to grips with this. Because any history of passing in a family, if you're on this side of it, if you're on the what ends up being the white side of it, I suppose, the inheritance is enormously complicated, because everything that you are told, everything that my mother was told, she was brought up in an environment of complete secrecy. Everything was hidden, everything was obfuscated. This is not something we talk about. And that's the message she got from her father, was like, this is something you do not talk about. And with that comes, for a child, honestly comes a sort of shame. It's like, you don't talk about this. It must be scary to talk about. It must be bad to talk about this. It must be bad that I have this inside myself if my father won't talk about it. So it's not like she grew up denying it. It was just so buried. And yet she experienced incidents of racism. She experienced the world in a very complicated way. People have made assumptions about her. Opera magazines would write about her and use words like exotic. And yet she didn't have access to a sense of community or pride in her blackness. She couldn't say, I'm black. She didn't have that language. So I would look at her and I would think, but I know people who look like you and do identify that way, and talk about this and have a different experience of this. And what is it? Please tell me. Please tell me, I want to know. Because I want to know what my heritage is. I want to know what that means for me, for my children. I want to know. And my mother, it's not like she wouldn't. She couldn't. She really couldn't. And I think I had to do this in a way for her.
Well, fortunate for us that you did, and we cannot wait to see what you do next. I mean, you're an incredible director. And yeah. Thank you for being here, Rebecca. Thank you.
Pleasure, thank you.